So that's the policy. What was the outcome? Well, in the short run, as we've seen is a common feature of policies of forced industrialisation, there's some success associated with this policy. The policy definitely succeeds in increasing industrialisation. It succeeds in achieving relatively high rates of economic growth by historical standards in Latin America. So if you remember back to the first section of this lecture, that the period from 1950 to 1980, it's certainly not a period where Latin America is growing as rapidly as Western Europe or growing as rapidly as Asia, but by historical terms in Latin America, it's a period of reasonable economic growth. And there are higher wages in the sector where industrialisation is occurring, which is manufacturing industry. So you would want to describe this as a period where there is some short-run successes, especially judged in terms of historical experience in Latin America. Here's a table that shows the point that I just made about the success in industrialising, increasing shares of industrial output in the period, in all of these countries, in the period from 1929 through to 1957, for example, and continuing after that as the policy of ISI continues in the 1960s and 1970s. In the long run, though, this is a policy that's perceived to have significant shortcomings. In terms of the effect on living standards, so maybe our best overall criterion for judging the success of the policy, by 1970 it's still the case that 40% of families in Latin America live below the poverty line. So although there's steady economic growth during the period, although workers in manufacturing industry become much better off, the large extent of inequality, which I've talked about previously, concentrated largely amongst agricultural workers who still account for a large proportion of the population in these Latin American economies, mean that there's a large proportion of the population still living below the poverty line. In other words, the model of ISI has not achieved rates of increase in economic growth over a sufficiently long period of time to lift a large number of the population out of poverty in the way, for example, that we see happening in China or in some of the other or some of the high-performing Asian economies during this period. And that's because it turns out that there's a variety of problems with the ISI model. One of them is what I've called here a fundamental problem of sustainability. And that sustainability is to do with external balance in Latin America. It's financial relations with the rest of the world. So what ISI does is it directs economic activity in Latin America away from areas in which Latin America has a comparative advantage. So that is a supply of agricultural and raw materials. So that's going to decrease or stop increase in existing exports. Then the problem is that the industries you're promoting are really not efficient on a world scale in producing the products they're producing. So to give you a perspective on that, the automobile industry. In the 1960s, the early 1960s, the minimum efficient scale for producing automobiles in the United States was 200,000. So if you owned an auto firm and you wanted to be producing at minimum average cost, or the minimum cost per car of production, you needed to be producing about 200,000 per year. But in Latin America, so in Argentina, where there was car production going on, the total market at the same time was only 50,000 cars. So the total market size was not large enough to allow economies of scale to make that industry competitive with international producers. And so the cost of producing motor vehicles at the time in Argentina and Brazil, say, is about 2.5 times what it was in the United States. So out of the industrialisation, and unlike, for example, is happening around the same time in some of the high-performing Asian economies, you don't get any new exports coming. So the source of export income is really declining. Now, that might be okay because that's actually what the ISI strategy was envisaged on. But the ISI strategy envisaged imports decreasing to match that decrease in exports, and that didn't happen. In fact, what happens is that it turns out to industrialise, you need higher imports of raw materials and capital in order to industrialise. So just as Western Europe needs to be buying machinery from the rest of the world, just as Asia needs to be buying machinery from the rest of the world, in order to industrialise, Latin America needs to be doing the same. And so rather than bringing imports down towards exports, instead what we find is imports staying above exports or an increasing external imbalance. So ISI policy is essentially unsuccessful in dealing with the issue of the foreign trade gap. That's a problem that gradually worsens in the 50s and 60s, then is significantly exacerbated by the OPEC oil price increases, which mean that Latin American countries are now having to pay even higher prices for their imports of oil. Of course, there were oil exporting countries in Latin America, in particular Mexico, or Mexico and Venezuela. They also, or they're not exempt from the problems that other countries in Latin America are experiencing, because they've essentially made very large borrowings on the basis of what they forecast to be their future export earnings. A lot of those borrowings, rather than going into productive investments that are going to generate an income to pay back the borrowings, are used for other political or consumption purposes. And so even Mexico and Venezuela, which you might have thought would be benefiting this period because they've run up large debts, they're in fact experiencing similar problems to the other countries in Latin America. Governments try or are forced to adopt a variety of ways of then propping up the system. So one way of propping up local economies is running large government fiscal deficits financed by printing money. That causes very high rates of inflation in Latin America beginning in the 1970s, which becomes a major source of macroeconomic instability. So inflation across Latin America averaged 7% in 1970-71. It's gone up to 45% by 1974-75, and by 82-83, it's over 200%. To some extent, Latin America can draw on loans and funding from the World Bank to deal with the problem of external imbalance that exists. But then the only other way of dealing with the problem of external imbalance is borrowing from foreign banks. So this is an era where the Latin American countries, essentially through the strategy of ISI, are forced to engage in extensive borrowing from foreign banks. And that borrowing from foreign banks, as I'll say in just a minute, becomes a major source of crisis in these Latin American countries. The macroeconomic instability caused by printing money, the external imbalance and the crises that will occur, that really becomes a major source of social unrest and political instability in Latin America in the 70s and 80s as a result of the long-run problems caused by the ISI-type policies. This is a graph that gives you a perspective on governments trying to shore up their economy, their local economies, through running or through government expenditure. The blue line shows public sector expenditure as a share of GDP in 1970. The red line is 1980. You can see in every case except Chile, 1980 is above 1970, and in some cases like Venezuela, Peru, Brazil, above it by quite a large amount. And so when you take out when you put the tax part in and realise that that wasn't growing anywhere near as fast as expenditure, essentially you are having large fiscal deficits causing, through the printing of money to finance those deficits, high rates of inflation. This is a perspective on the growth of external debt. So this is Latin America total external debt rising, you can see, from 7.2 billion US in 1960 to 20.8 in 1970 to 230 billion by 1980, and then 315 billion in 1982. So basically skyrocketing external debt as a way of financing the imbalance between imports and exports. There's a recognition from even as early as the 1960s that there are some problems with this new economic strategy of ISI that's being used, and some attempts to redress some of the problems that are seen with economic outcomes at the time. So for example, from the 1960s, there's various attempts to increase the capacity of the Latin American economies to trade amongst themselves, to try and promote economic growth through greater intra-regional trade. So for example, the attempt to negotiate a Latin American free trade agreement, the Andean agreement, or attempts to address the problem of external imbalance by promoting greater intra-Latin American trade. In the 1970s, the southern cone of countries, Chile, Argentina, undertake fiscal reform and some undoing of relative price distortions from the 1970s. But elsewhere, there's little reform, or if there is reform, in the direction of further or more thoroughgoing ISI type policies. So in other words, while there's some limited recognition of problems with economic outcomes at the time, no really thoroughgoing attempt to address that through policy making, to change the direction of policy. So what resulted from the direction in which ISI was pushing the economy and the absence of a major change in policy direction was a series of economic crises throughout Latin America. And that's what I want to finish up talking about now in this section of the lecture. I want to start out by talking about what the mechanics of crisis in when it occurred in countries in Latin America was. So I've already described how ISI didn't do anything to resolve and exacerbated really trade imbalances that countries in Latin America had, and how they were forced to finance those trade imbalances by foreign borrowing. Of course, when that foreign borrowing reaches certain levels, then foreign borrowers became less willing to continue lending to Latin America. Then Latin American countries are forced to essentially draw on international reserves. Once those international reserves are exhausted or almost exhausted, then the only response to deal with the external imbalance is really currency devaluation. If you can't borrow to sustain the imbalance between exports and imports, if you can't finance that out of your own international reserves, then you've got to change the price of exports and imports to try and promote sales of your exports and force down purchases of imports. So countries in Latin America, because of the trade imbalance situation they developed, were forced into currency devaluation in the 1970s and 1980s. Devaluation has two impacts. One impact is that it often causes significant domestic retrenchment and adjustment through the deflationary effect. The second impact of devaluation, and the impact which is really essential for understanding how external crises developed out of this chain of events that I've been describing was that it raised the cost of paying back the debt which the Latin American countries had accumulated. This was because a very large proportion of the foreign borrowings they'd made were denominated in US dollars. When they devalued, that meant that it increased the amount of their currency that was required to pay back $1 US. In other words, the local cost of paying back loans to US banks was expanded by the proportion by which the country had devalued its currency. And so that increase in the cost of debt really makes it much more difficult for Latin American countries to repay. It's also the case that the interest rates that they're having to pay on the debt increase during the early 1980s because of the Volcker deflation, where the US, in order to try and reduce inflation, adopts a regime of high interest rates. And so out of this combination of a much higher cost of repaying debt because of devaluation and through the increases in interest rates that occur, you get a raft of external defaults occurring in Latin America, a little bit in the 1970s, but particularly concentrated in this period in the early 1980s. And so in this table, I've got episodes of default from 1950 to 74 and 75 to 2008. And so the sort of episodes I'm talking about are Argentina 82, Brazil 83, Chile 83, Mexico 82, Uruguay 83, Venezuela 83. So one after another of these major Latin American countries defaulted or rescheduled its international debt in the early 1980s. And that was really a logical consequence of the policies of ISI, which had failed to redress this issue of a foreign trade gap, the fact that that was then funded by foreign borrowing denominated in US dollars, and the eventual need to address the foreign trade gap which had developed by devaluing the currency, which increased the cost of debt. In the final section of this lecture, we'll look at the period from the 1980s onwards and what attempts Latin American economies have made to seek to improve economic performance during that period.